Hello, everyone. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Rahul Matthan, founder and a very well-known TMT partner, technology partner at Trilegal. Beyond Trilegal, his work, particularly in technology policy area, has attracted tremendous attention. And today, why I have him here in this episode is his latest book, The Third Way. His previous books have also been making waves, but this one particularly has hit the public nerve very significantly. There's so much discussion around big tech, technology, DPIs, and so much happening around us, not just in India, but globally, that this book has caught the attention of a large number of audience. And today, I'm going to request Rahul to help us understand some of those complex themes and some of those affect us day to day, and some of those affect us strategically behind the scenes. But it's important that we figure them out. As a matter of introduction, Rahul Matthan studied law at NLS Bangalore. He was part of the second batch, and subsequently, after a few years, he founded with his couple of friends, now very famous Trilegal, which has a formidable name in technology space. And in addition to that, I know it's a full service law firm, operates in almost every practice area. To begin, Rahul, please help us understand why this title, The Third Way. What is the mystery behind it?
So first, thank you, Navneet, for engaging with the book and also inviting me to participate in this. The idea behind the third way essentially tries to capture the fact that for the longest time we've believed that there are only two approaches to data governance. There is the original approach that we started out with, which is the US approach, is essentially a laissez-faire approach. Let the companies that operate in the digital sphere, let them decide the way in which data should be governed. And then there's the European approach, which said, we can't rely on the companies to do this governance. We've got to put in place some regulations and laws that they have to comply with. And so, the European approach is a very regulatory-heavy approach. And I suggest in the book that there is actually a third way of doing data governance. That is what the book covers, which is, what I later on refer to as a techno-legal approach to governance, where, in a sense, we take a mixture of what the US approach is and what the European approach is, and try and come up with a framework for data governance. So that's the reason why it's a third way. The first way is the US approach, the second way is the European approach, and the third way is this new techno-legal approach that's based very much in digital public infrastructure.
If you don't mind me saying so, can I name it the Indian way also? Because perhaps this level of innovation has not happened elsewhere.
That's true. And look, there's no doubt that this is India's contribution to the space, because digital public infrastructure in its current form was, very much, I would say, invented in India. But the reason I hesitate to call it the India way is because, what India started, many other countries in the world are now, using and deploying. Particularly in the global south, I think you find that in more developed countries, they've got a lot of the systems are already set up and they're working reasonably well. So there's less of a need to, as they say, what's the point in fixing what's not broken? But for the developing world, there's a strong need to get this. And so what India pioneered as in a way is now being deployed and used in far more countries than I had actually even realized until I got into it in a little more detail. So yes, I mean, we could call it the India way because it's sort of started here, but it's much broader than India right now. So it's not like it's only India that's practicing this approach. There are more and more countries that are practicing it.
Great. And then let's now turn to the book. And in the introductory section, we have made a reference to how Justice B.N. Sri Krishna changed the whole approach. And he used two different terminologies. And I see a very profound, deep-rooted shift in how we deal with actors in the data ecosystem. Help us understand this shift to data principal and data fiduciary, because I think for our audience, it will be very critical to understand the background, what they're today reading in the DPDP Act.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Justice Sri Krishna picked on a very powerful point, and that, in a sense, underpins a lot of what the DPI idea is about, which is, around the world, the theory behind the regulation of data and data governance is data protection. That we must protect your data. And in India, we've moved to something which is a little more than that, which is data empowerment. You certainly have to protect your data, but you also have to allow that data to empower you. And that concept of being able to set the whole system up so that the personal data that pertains to you can also be used for your benefit is really the reason why Justice Sri Krishna refocused the regulation, what was going to become a data protection regulation, to say that look, we're going to keep the citizen, we're going to keep the individual at the center of that whole equation. And so, around the world, data protection regulation refers to the person whose data is being collected and processed as the data subject. That is the subject of the law. And the person, company, or otherwise that is collecting and processing the data, that's referred to as the data controller. Now, Justice Sri Krishna said that the last time I was anyone's subject, the Queen of England ruled India. And so I want to change this term, data subject. And he changed it to data principal, indicating that this is the principal element of this legislation and regulation. And then the data controller was called the data fiduciary, because the concept of a fiduciary is someone who holds data or information or anything like that in trust for the person who has given them that data. So this is a very different kind of a framing where we say that, look, it's the person who is really the center of this whole regulation. And we're now going to say that the data controller is a fiduciary with regard to that person's data. And then you can see the whole, the whole concept of empowerment and things like that, how easily it falls out of this very powerful central framing.
Excellent. I think that's really very profound to bring that sense of responsibility through using this word fiduciary. And that's really profound. And I'm very hopeful that in next decade, as this new law is implemented, this will be implemented by all actors with great amount of responsibility, with which Justice Sri Krishna introduced these two terms. All right. You mentioned so much about data, and you have captured so much transformation has happened in our economy and elsewhere globally because of data-driven businesses. In a quick manner, can you cite a couple of good examples how that transformation has happened? You have quoted number of commercial examples and number of socially sensitive examples. Help us understand this transformation, please.
Yeah, so data has been an incredible, force in the last, I want to say 20, 30, 40 years. And I say this sort of in a vague and fuzzy way because the real power of data came, and in the book I go all the way sort of to the birth of computers, but really the power comes out of networked computing, where many computers that have data could then be networked with each other, and we could start to see the power of data. And of course, it's logarithmic, the way in which this improves, because the more computers that are connected to the internet, the more people using the internet, the easier it is to use the internet. As we start to see Facebook and before that MySpace and various social media type gatekeepers, sort of transforming the internet experience to something that people can, you don't need to be technically savvy to be able to use it. Now that is really the power of network computing. And as a result of that, there are so many things that we take for granted today that just would not have existed. I mean, the simple wonder of the smartphone, the fact that you can take out your phone out of your pocket and press a button, and a vehicle will come to your doorstep to take you to wherever you want to go. It's almost magical because you just think about all the things that are happening there. One is your smartphone is telling the taxi driver where exactly you are. The taxi driver is driving around somewhere, so it's actually correlating the nearest taxi drivers to you and sort of making this offer. More importantly, it's actually bringing demand to supply, which is a very serious problem. Before we solved it using this, I remember many times when I'd be waiting for a taxi on a particular street, and on just the parallel street, there would be a long line of taxi cabs waiting for passengers. Neither of us knew that the other was just, like 2 minutes away. And this is what, these sorts of innovations have unlocked. And then there are so many others. There's healthcare innovations. There's just the ability to just remember things. We've got photographs on our phone stored on the cloud, and every now and then these memories can be programmatically thrown up to us. Sometimes it allows us to make connections that we would not have otherwise made, and things like that. So there's just just an almost infinite number of things that data technologies have done to improve our lives. That I do a small fraction of those in the book, but it's really a very vast field of all the various things that it does.
And you also mentioned about some of those possibilities, for instance, personalized treatment or personalized education. I think those could have much deeper impact. Of course, those come with some amount of threats also, but I think the possibilities are tremendous, and those you have captured in your book very eloquently. Let's now, okay, so you want to touch upon those?
No, but so very briefly, I mean, you're right. I think perhaps the things that I mentioned in response to your question are a lot more frivolous than the things that really the powerful innovations with healthcare. I think, with healthcare, for example, right now when we go to the doctor, we're going to the doctor, the poor doctor. When we walk in, has 2 or 3 minutes to evaluate what's wrong with us, on the basis of just the immediate checkup that they're doing. What's your temperature, what's your heart rate, do you have a cough, kind of a thing. But because we now have wearables, we've got data of all our medical ailments for a long period of time, doctors now have a much more deep set of data points that they can think about to evaluate what's wrong with us and right with us. And that's fundamentally going to allow them to do much more personalized treatment. They can provide us treatments that are aimed directly at us. And equally with education, I think, children for the longest time have been subject to the tyranny of the classroom, which is, either the teacher is teaching to the most intelligent student, in which case the least intelligent or the slow learner is really struggling, or the teachers aimed the class of the slow learner because that's the place where they need most help, and the advanced learner is just wasting time. And if we can change that, make it more personalized, obviously it's going to benefit society much more.
That's true. And now let's shift the gears and bring the DPI, which is the core piece of the book. And of course, there is a great deal of explanation you have given in terms of the design, in terms of execution, operations, and its effects, policy effects, effects on markets and whatnot. It is definitely a great read, as on date, most updated. But to begin with, Rahul, please help us, with a quick overview of India's DPI journey. And I quote from your book, you have very clearly mentioned three phases: access, engage, and empowerment. So those are three clear phases you have mentioned. So give us some sense, and then perhaps we can pick up each of those layers one by one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and this is the Indian journey, and in a sense, the articulation into access, engagement, and empowerment was to help categorize DPIs into different buckets. Just to be completely clear, this is sort of the sequence that India followed, but it's not a necessary sequence. If you think about other countries, you don't have to go in this step-by-step sequence. But generally speaking, when you start out on the digitalization journey, you need some kind of an infrastructure to allow people to gain access to this digital ecosystem. Those are typically identity and credentials technologies. And in India, of course, the identity technology is Aadhaar, our foundational identity system. But there are many other identity systems. There's derived identity systems that we get from, you say, a health ID or various other things. And then once you've got access into the ecosystem, there's a whole set of transactional DPIs, infrastructure that allow you to interact with other people who are so identified. And the best example of this is really payments, because two people who can be uniquely identified, uniquely enough for us to be certain that when we're sending money, it goes to the person it's intended to and not to someone else. At that point in time, it becomes possible for us to engage in just a simple transactional arrangement of sending someone some money, or something more complex, which is engaging in some sort of a purchase or more structured payment. So that's the second layer and there are many other examples of this. There's sort of commercial arrangements, there's various services that are provided, there's tax that you pay, things like that. And after you've done this for a while, what happens is you've laid down these digital trails. You've built a history of engagement. And that history of engagement actually contains within it some signals as to various things. Just take payments, for example. The signals that are hidden in your engagement are your ability to pay. The kinds of transactions, the volume of transactions that you do, the nature of the transactions that you do. And if this information can be provided to someone who is evaluating you for, let's say, a loan or eligibility for some service, this information can actually be used by them to arrive at some sort of a conclusion about you, and therefore, provide you that service or not. And I think for those of us who have other sorts of collateral, if we're privileged enough to have a house or something like that we can put down as collateral, this is not a big deal. But for a lot of people in the country, they don't have this privilege. And so the ability to be able to leverage their digital trails, the transactional activities that were part of the engagement layer into this information collateral that could then give them some other additional benefit that otherwise they would not have been entitled to. That is what I call empowerment. And that that later phase where the first two phases are now allowing you only by themselves to get additional power and additional value. That is what I call the empowerment phase.
And I think this empowerment, which you have highlighted, the only other parallel example which comes to my mind of this kind of personal empowerment is only education. That gives you that kind of empowerment. Otherwise, this technology is one which is really mitigating your limitations the way you articulated, because you have acquired certain digital credentials, and that makes you eligible for certain loan or credit or any other entitlement or facility whatsoever it might be. So this is truly worth pondering over, because this requires some time to sink in that this is the level of empowerment DPI can bring in. And let's now pick up these three layers. And so you mentioned about Aadhaar, and you also mentioned how your book started with a conversation with Nandan Nilekani himself. So help us understand this whole, because many people understand Aadhaar. We use it most often now these days for identification, but there is a lot more which has gone into making of it, and now which goes into variety of benefits it delivers. So please demystify this whole thing so that people can comprehend it well enough.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think when we started the DPI journey in this country, it was quite clear that if you are going to offer digital services to people, you've got to be able to uniquely identify them. So that's in a sense a fundamental shortcoming of digitalization. If you are looking to provide services to someone and you don't have a reliable, unique identification mechanism, your entire digitalization is going to fail. It's going to go to the wrong people. You're going to have fraud. You're going to have all of these sorts of things. And so I think the fundamental purpose behind Aadhaar was really to ensure that we could digitalize, and if we were digitalizing, the basic thing that we need to have is an identity. Now, when we say identity, almost every country in the world has some form of identity, because it's essential for government services. The state needs to know who the citizen is, because the state is to provide the citizen any sort of service. It needs to be able to identify who is receiving the service. And so we've had identities of all sorts, all shapes and sizes for decades, maybe even centuries. But never before, until Aadhaar, did we create a digital identity. And this is a truly digital identity in that, even though we all have Aadhaar cards that we show, actually that Aadhaar card is not particularly useful. All that Aadhaar really does is it takes that number, and the number is the critical thing, and it allows you to authenticate that number against the Central Information Data Repository, which essentially is this master record of who in India is who. It's sort of a database of identity. Now, this is extraordinarily powerful because once you've got the ability to uniquely identify a person in this digital way, you can then plug that into all sorts of benefits, all sorts of services. You can ensure that ration is delivered to the correct person and not to someone else. You can ensure that any sort of subsidy or benefit actually gets to the person. We realized that when we applied Aadhaar to the LPG database, that as many as 20% of the people on that database were ghosts. Ghosts are people who either are long dead and their children continue to take the benefit in their name, or people who never existed that were just put into the system. And you can imagine that when 20% of the LPG database doesn't exist, that's the level of loss to the exchequer that's happening. Loss to exchequer also translates into people who need this not receiving this because it's going to someone else. So you can start to see that once you've got identity and you've got these sorts of features, there's a lot that can be unlocked because of the way in which identity is critical to the delivery of public services. I just want to add at this stage, I know this is not the question, but Aadhaar is essentially telling you who you are. Another very important layer to the access is what you are, and that is credentials. And so we must mention DigiLocker as well. DigiLocker, most people don't even think too much about it. Everyone in India has a DigiLocker, use it every now and then. But currently, 200 million people use the system. There are 6.2 billion documents that are on the DigiLocker system. These are documents that have been issued by some government department or some university or something like that. During COVID, our vaccination certificate was on DigiLocker. DigiLocker is a digital representation of a credential. The credential could be how much you've studied. It could be any sort of skill. It could be the fact that you're COVID free. It could be the fact that you can drive a car. All of these are credentials, which, in addition to your identity, entitle you to certain things. And this is all digital, and it is completely verifiable because it has been digitally signed by a government authority that has issued it. And that these two things, identity and credentials together, is sort of the base layer that unlocks all sorts of other value down the chain.
That's truly phenomenal because when this whole Aadhaar thing started, no one really realized that this is going to be the transformational or the ripple effect of Aadhaar. But clearly, it has had much bigger ripple than we originally thought of it. Coming to the second layer of engagement, you have written quite extensively about the massive payment revolution which has happened in India. So help us comprehend this engagement layer, and then we will come to the empowerment layer where even greater details await us.
So the payment layer, the engagement layer is, as I described earlier, is once you're identified, what are the transactions that you can do? And India's big innovation in this area was the development of the Unified Payment Interface, or UPI, which is a payment protocol that allows just ordinary citizens, you and me, to be able to transfer money between each other. And look, this is the basic articulation of it, but it's a much more sophisticated thing. There are many other things that you can do now. You know that with UPI, you can apply for a capital markets listing. There's a whole set of things you can do. You've got sort of monthly payments, all sorts of things, right? So it basically unlocks a whole set of payment transactions. Now, the innovation that India made, there are all sorts of digital payments. The one that we use most frequently around the world is supported by the card networks, Visa, MasterCard, American Express. These are essentially ways in which people who have their money in a particular bank account can actually engage and interact with other people who may or may not have money in the same bank account. So essentially, we've got a payment system that interacts with the banks to allow these payments to be made between one and the other. UPI is essentially the same thing. But if you break it down, UPI is a messaging system. It's a way in which an individual can message his or her bank and say, look, I want you to transfer money to such and such other bank, to the account of such person, and to do it in the blink of an eye, just like sending an SMS message. Now that is really the innovation and the wonder of UPI. It is one of those things that are called fast payment systems. I think if you think back to even 15, 20 years ago, payment was such a problem. The most efficient way to do it was to do it in cash, because the moment you give someone cash, automatically they have that value. For everything else, there was a check that had to clear. Sometimes it cleared, sometimes it didn't clear. You'd have a signature mismatch, and then you'd have to do the whole process again. You wouldn't have funds, or the person who was paying you didn't have funds. The check would bounce. All these things characterized the payment ecosystem before UPI. Now that UPI has come, it's actually completely digital, and it happens quite seamlessly. And really, that is the miracle of India's payment ecosystem.
In fact, what you mentioned, when we used to use cards, the interoperability of payments was entirely missing. And UPI has completely solved that problem. So therefore, and no wonder the whole world is talking that how even a vegetable vendor and a rickshawala and a cab driver, almost everybody, even at the bottom of the pyramid, is enjoying the fruits of UPI. So that's a massive success. And then you have very beautifully explained the empowerment layer, which is the most profound layer, and also the which leads the maximum results also. So take us through the empowerment layer, what goes into it, and how it works.
Yeah, so the idea behind the empowerment layer, as I said, once you've built up digital trails, how can we use the digital trails to your advantage? The way you have to think about it is today, we all have a lot of data that's with various entities. But all of this data, even though it pertains to us, is under the control of someone else. And so the question for us is, how do we unlock the value in this data for our benefit? How do we break it out of the silo? And how do we do that breaking out of a silo in a way that's actually privacy preserving and gets us whatever value we need? Because remember, what we're doing is we are suggesting that we give data to someone else. So from one person who has the data to another, and you know that if we don't think about this and do it carefully, it could actually violate our privacy. It could cause us a lot of harm. So in designing this empowerment layer, we had to, on the one hand, unlock the data from the silos in which they're in. And on the other hand, we had to ensure that we did this in a way that was privacy preserved, and that in trying to empower someone, we didn't actually expose them very, very dramatically to significant risk. And that really is the data empowerment and protection architecture, which is a protocol that currently has been rolled out in the financial services sector it's called the account aggregator that the RBI operates. What the account aggregator system does is it essentially connects through the means of a new intermediary called the consent manager or the account aggregator in the financial ecosystem, a host of data providers to data consumers. And I think the best way to explain this would be with an example. If someone wants to give you a loan, typically they would ask you for some information in order to evaluate your eligibility for a loan. Let's say they ask you for 6 months bank statements. The way you would currently do it today is you'd go to your bank and you would ask them for a 6 months bank statement. They may give it to you digitally, they may give you a printout. Whichever way they do it, you then carry that to the potential lender and you say, look, here's the information you asked. The lender will evaluate it. This is a time-consuming process. It's also a costly process. We estimate that it would cost something like 1,500 rupees to process a loan. That's just the cost of sort of doing this evaluation if you were doing it in this physical, non-digital way. What DEPA does is it makes this entire process digital. You make the request to the consent manager with your consent. The consent manager will then send you a consent request on your app. It'll look pretty much like a UPI payment request. You'll be able to study who's asked for the information, what exact information they've asked for, and then you'll be able to authorize it. And then once you authorize it, the consent manager takes this digitally signed consent request that's now been approved by the user and sends it to the bank, saying that, look, now the user instructed you to send this information. Now you have to generate the information and give it to us. And then that information is packaged. Essentially, the 6 months bank statement that was requested is collected, digitally signed, encrypted, and sent to the person asking for it. So what would have taken 1 or 2 days in this old physical world now happens just like in a matter of seconds. And then the lender has this information, can evaluate you. The lender can actually, what's more important is the lender can actually trust this information. If we were doing it the old physical way, what's to stop someone from using Photoshop to change the bank statements in their favor or doing something like that? And the lender would have no way to evaluate that. In fact, after a year and a half of running the account aggregator ecosystem, a very remarkable statistic came out. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but fraud rates using the DEPA system dropped to zero. Now, it's very difficult for people to use the word zero when you talk about rates. But in the DEPA ecosystem, actually, fraud rates have dropped down to zero, because it is actually impossible to commit fraud when the systems are designed such that it is completely end-to-end digital. There's no human intervention in the middle, and you have an audit trail because every statement is digitally signed. So that is sort of the some of the remarkable statistics around what this new empowerment phase of DPI can do.
In fact, no wonder why the government of the day has so much impetus, so much emphasis on technology first principle while designing any public policy. No wonder, because this is delivering, this is bound to deliver going forward. So, Rahul, having understood these three layers now, let's shift gears and focus on the core design principles, which which have informed India's digital public infrastructure. And I understand there's a lot of learning, distilled learning you have provided in your book. So help us understand how different components of DPI ecosystem remain consistent, interoperable, and why services provided by one digital ecosystem can, with little technical effort, be efficiently consumed and incorporated into other. You have already given some examples, but let's please articulate the principles so that we understand the logic behind its operations.
Sure. Look, and I mean, I think there's a lot more detail in the book, and I'll just sort of very quickly skim over this. But core to India's DPI is a set of principles that very much define the success of India's DPI, and it's important to sort of understand how exactly that works if you want to properly understand, what India's DPI is about. So, at the one level, the core design principle is this principle of interoperability that you spoke about. The idea is that you should create a digital building block that serves a particular purpose, but that could also be incorporated into other building blocks, so that when you're creating a solution, a digital solution, you don't have to reuse this concept again. So just take identity, for example. If you've got an identity building block, you should have some way in which you can reuse that identity building block in any other solution that you're doing. You don't have to rebuild an identity ecosystem. And similar payments, right? So we've got a powerful payments system. We should be able to integrate that payment system into some other commercial application, or into a tax application, or into a direct benefits transfer application. So I think this concept of interoperability is an extraordinarily powerful concept. It's core to DPI. Just to, and I'll do this once so that you can understand why we're harping on it. But the alternative, which many countries use, is this vendor-based approach, where they will, if they want an identity system, they'll go to a vendor and say, give me an identity system. If they want a direct benefit transfer system, they'll say, give me a direct benefit transfer system. And the vendor will build this end-to-end. And when they build it end-to-end, they will actually build a identity component, they will build a payment component, they will build all of these things from scratch just to solve this particular use case. Now, that is incredibly wasteful. And the power of the DPI ecosystem is that once you build a payment infrastructure, you don't have to worry about building it ever again, because that payment infrastructure is completely digitally interoperable and capable of being integrated with any other system. And so I think that is the power of the interoperability feature. The other thing that we talk about very often is what we call federated data. The idea of this is, let data stay at the edges or wherever it is, When you use a new DPI, the idea should not be to collect all the data and bring it into a new centralized location. Keep it where it is, but ensure that you build pipes so that when you need it, you can access the information and make it available. But don't ever take that information and store it in a sort of centralized location. This is very important because the moment you centralize information, you create a much higher risk of data breach or theft or any of those things. Look, we're always going to be at the risk of data theft. We're going to be at the risk of having some sort of a breach. But if we can keep data federated, we're lowering the surface of attack. If someone gets hacked, it's only a part of the data that gets hacked. You haven't compromised all of the data. And then, one of the core things that we try and, focus on is this concept of protocols and the fact that we must define protocols. This sort of goes into some of the techno-legal governance. I guess we can get into that later. But the idea behind referring to protocols is around the world, we tend to think of platform. We tend to think that we must build these large, even government services. They look to building a platform, a place where the various market participants can come together and interoperate. The problem with platforms is that it has this sort of centralization risk that the platform becomes too big to fail. There's all sorts of competition-related, monopoly-related questions that come about. And we've seen many instances where platforms that were very important in a particular ecosystem eventually become corrupt. I say corrupt in not in sort of a pejorative way, but more that it just becomes difficult to achieve its original intention. And we can avoid all of that if we just allow people to interact with each other in the manner that they want, because we've published protocols. So if I want to connect with you, I know all I need to do is make the request in a format that aligns with the protocol by which you connect. And I don't need to create a platform for it. I can actually sort of reach out to you directly with my request. This is actually a very powerful way to think about it, and has many benefits and advantages over the platform-based approach. There's a lot else, but I'll stop here because this is sort of the part of the book which is actually quite detailed, and it may be worthwhile sitting down and reading through those principles.
That's right. So you mentioned about interoperability, the design principle of federation, and there you also explained us how connecting data silos became useful principle. And then you touched upon protocols, very clearly a very powerful design principle, because you've explained in a very eloquent manner how protocols, not platforms. That's how you have explained the power of the DPI. And there's one more principle you explained, that is unbundling. And that has led to better governance of DPI. Could you briefly touch upon that as well?
Yeah, look, I mean, unbundling is perhaps a different way of talking about what I often call path dependence. We tend, when we come up with new governance frameworks, to look to the past and see how has this been done before, perhaps in another sector, perhaps previously in this sector, and then we tend to repeat. This is the way we did it last time. Let's just slightly modify it and do it again. Of course, we can do that, and there's nothing sort of wrong with that. But what the DPI approach does, which is very different from just digitalization, is it unpacks the entire workflow, breaking it down to its sort of basic atomic level, and then puts it back together again to achieve whatever the objective is. Now, when you do this, when you really take something apart and put it back, you'll find that as you're putting it back, there are many efficiencies that you can get by trying to put it back in a slightly different way. There would have been many reasons why in the offline world we built a particular workflow. But the digital world allows us to eliminate many steps in that workflow for many reasons. And if we just continue to use the steps that we use in the offline world, because that's the way things are done, we don't get efficiencies. Now, that is how we build the technology side of the DPI. But as I looked at it, I said, this is also eminently applicable to the governance side of the UPI, of the DPI as well. As we think of the laws, the regulations, the protocols, the contracts that govern our DPI ecosystem, why don't we just also see if we can unbundle the governance aspects of it? Is there new ways in which we can think through writing up contracts? Is there new ways in which you can think through, if a particular environment is described completely in code, where it's an entirely end-to-end digital transaction, do we need all the contractual provision that would otherwise have been required when we didn't have that end-to-end, right? And so, is that something that we can think about? So that's the idea of unbundling, to take an existing governance workflow, break it apart, and say, can we now articulate a governance workflow for this, but do it in a very different way that we can, come up with new outcomes and new alternatives. That's the idea behind unbundling.
And then, there's so much in the book about the design principles, how the entire journey of last almost 2 decades have unfolded, and what we're seeing today has been possible. Let's come to the data part one more time. And you have quoted, and I'm quoting from your book, that by giving data principals control over their data, DEPA has operationalized the right to data portability. I mean, a lot of people were talking about it, but to make it operational has been possible. So given this, how has it impacted the ability to compete or competitiveness? Ability to compete by digital firms, and also the overall state of competition in digital markets. So give us a sense of how this data policy work has impacted the nature of competition in market.
Yeah, so I think let me just stick with the financial services ecosystem. It's, we could go into all sorts of ecosystems, but just take a look at the financial services ecosystem, where typically you would go back to your existing bank for a loan. Why would you do that? Because your bank has in its own systems full details of how you spend your money, what the money you earn, the money you spend. It's very easy for them to actually look at that and evaluate you for a loan. The amount of interest, the interest rate they would give you, the tenure, all of these things. The problem with this is that the bank knows that it's got you captured, that you will come back to the bank. And so they know that it's actually quite difficult for you, quite painful for you to go to someone else and perhaps try and get a better deal. The reason why they can do this is because they have the best access to the data that's required to evaluate you. Now, if there is some way in which we can break that access, we can say that not just your existing bank, but any bank, or not just any bank, any fintech, any NBFC, any entity that is capable of giving you a loan, what if we give them access, the same access that your existing bank has? What if we give all of them access to the same data? And what we found is when you do something like that, these other entities are very hungry to get a new customer. And so they will start to compete against each other to give you a better loan. The only thing that your existing bank had that was a sort of a moat against this sort of activity was this exclusive access to your data. By setting something like DEPA up, which breaks that monopoly, we actually open the doors for much more competitive interaction, much more competitive financial services being provided to you. It also forces your existing bank to be a lot more proactive in the services they provide, because they realize now that moat, that the data moat that they had is no longer valid, and that you could potentially go to someone else with very little friction. So this is one way, we've always worried about the fact that in the data economy, there will be some entities that will accumulate so much data that you are dependent on them and you will never be able to change the service provider. Something like DAPA, something that allows the data to remain where it is, but breaks the access monopoly to that data and democratizes that access monopoly to the data, is really something that I think could be very powerful.
In fact, that also justifies the third way title, because if you see, Rahul, Europe has already enacted DMA and DSA, the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. America is contemplating something to control this, and India has been contemplating also a digital competition law. The entire 23 we have been debating this. And one hypothesis which scholars are contemplating, can our DPI address, if not fully, partially, the problem of sticky market power, which some of the big tech firms pose? And this is what the whole world is contemplating, whether, for example, now you mentioned UPI, there's another experiment in making ONDC. People are looking at that with a tremendous amount of hope. So perhaps that's one question which I would call like work in progress. There a lot of hope is being pinned there, but in terms of in terms of regulating this whole thing, you have also posed a role for non-profit self-regulatory organization, and not many people realize that how critical that is to the entire DPI architecture. So help us understand the importance of that, and why, if you allow me to use a term from economics, helped us address this market failure, which otherwise would have been captured by a particular firm and not really would become a common facility. So help us understand the role of those non-profit SROs and how they are enabling and how they are playing their role in this system.
Yeah, look, I mean, in the book, it's called The Third Way, and if you look carefully in the book, you'll see many triangles, and this is one of the triangles in the book, and that is that the DPI ecosystem is comprised of government, private sector, and this non-profit ecosystem. And the reason why I talk in triangles is because the triangle, as you know, is the most stable structure with the least number of parts. Because we need to be, as we build these systems, we need to understand that incentives play a role in what every market participant does. If you allowed the private sector to build governance, as the US did, you would find that they would be driven by shareholder interests. If you allow the government to regulate a digital ecosystem, you will find that the government is incapable of making the innovations required in order to make the ecosystem advance. And so I say that there is a role for this sort of third-party self-regulatory organization. And I actually mentioned two. I mentioned self-regulatory organizations and technical standards organizations, both of which need to be sort of in this quasi-government, quasi-private kind of a realm in order for them to work. So why do we need self-regulatory organizations? We will always have regulators. We're coming up with a new regulator now, or a sort of a board in the data sphere once the Digital Personal Data Protection law comes into effect. But there is a limit to what a regulator can do. In most areas, we're going to get down to some very, very narrow sectoral areas of implementation that it's not possible for a generic regulator to have the full knowledge and vision of what is required to regulate. And so I think it's almost inevitable that we create some subordinate regulatory function. And the suggestion is that we create what is sort of well known as a self-regulatory organizational framework where you have these entities that determine how that micro market will work. And some micro markets are actually very large. So if you think about the DPI ecosystem in finance, there's just a very large micro market that's operating there, which is a micro market of lenders, wealth managers, um, people that are providing all sorts of advisory services in the financial services sector. Who's going to regulate them? Certainly the RBI could regulate them, but there's a limit to how much the RBI could regulate them as you get deeper and deeper into the technology sphere. And so that is where I think we need to think of some sort of a subordinate regulatory layer, and that's what I call the SROs. And I think the SROs are going to be very important to the success of these ecosystems. SROs would need to not be profit-oriented entities, because if they're profit-oriented entities, then they will build regulatory frameworks that align with profit incentives. So they have to be non-profit. They need representation from the entire market, from PSU banks, from private banks, from fintechs, from Google Pay and Phone Pay type TPAP entities. All of these need to be represented. And once all of them are properly represented, we will have a solid governance, because the voice of every element in the ecosystem will be represented at the board. Now, these are difficult organizations to set up. And in order to set it up, you need to have this sort of a self-regulatory organizational framework to sort of start thinking about it. So that's the reason for the SROs.
Great. And I think you mentioned at least twice, and looks like you have been deeply impacted by Lessig's four prongs, which he has given: laws, norms, markets, and codes. And I think this looks like a perfect balance of all those four elements, what DPI poses and we have been able to achieve. So that's really very impressive how government has played its role, and how it has ceded a space for private sector to build on, and how there is a certain space which has been carved out for SROs, and that's how the ecosystem has been completed. And on a lighter note, I mean, I remember a shampoo ad, shampoo and conditioner ka sahi santulan. I think that's the kind of balance this whole ecosystem poses here. Excellent. Let's also talk a little bit about the flip side. You mentioned a couple of examples where, Santoshi Kumari and Rooplal Marandi face some sort of exclusion. And there are two kinds of exclusions you have mentioned. One, which is brought by because inability to access the system, and the second, which is inability to engage with the technology. How are we overcoming this? Because in a country like India, I think we cannot ignore the challenge of exclusion. How are we addressing it?
Yeah, look, I think, see, when you set up digital technology and you say that this is the way in which you will access services, it's incumbent on the government to make sure that everyone can access the services. You can't set something up that only the top 10% of the country can operate, and say this is the way everyone's going to receive benefits when people just don't even have access to it. So obviously there's this obligation that we must not leave anyone behind as we build these systems. So you're right. I think I talk about two types of exclusion. The first is just lack of infrastructure. I mean, in order to run digital public infrastructure, you need the core digital infrastructure, which is data. We need bandwidth. We need telecom towers. We need all of these things. If they don't exist, then the people who are in the area which is not covered by this will not be able to gain access. The second element is, some of the technologies to use it are expensive. Not everyone has smartphones, and if you're only going to serve this over smartphones, then people who have feature phones are not going to be able to avail it. So if you think about that, it's first of all, it's impossible, completely impossible to ever get complete coverage of anything. We will always be approaching complete coverage. There will always be some place somewhere where there is no coverage. And knowing that that is the case, we've got to build our system such that it works in this online offline kind of a way. And if you think about other, when we enrolled people in other, there was actually a system where people would go into a remote area, do the enrollment, and then come back into an area where there's network, and then upload it to UIDI's central database. So that kind of a thinking, this online offline thinking, has always been part from the very beginning to that. And you look now, we use for payments QR codes. QR codes at the end of the day is just a piece of paper. It's the furthest from something which is connected, but it still contains within it data that allows you to receive payments into a bank without electricity, without connectivity. So these are the sorts of innovations that you have to do. So if the fact we don't have technology should not mean that people can't receive payments or they can't be identified. We've got to find ways to solve that. And always sort of assume that constantly an increasing number of people will get connected. In 2008, I think there may have been about 250 to 300 million smartphones. Today, we're closing on 750 million smartphones. And we've also got a lot of technology that can complete DPI-based transactions using feature phones, using USSD and other technologies, not to mention QR codes, which are completely offline. So I think that part of it is very important. And then the second part, which is, we assume that everyone's digitally literate, or at least will be able to handle things. And the reality is that's not the case. There are a lot of people who are not. And if we build these systems to be extremely complex, that require the ability to download things and install it and configure it and things like that, then you're fundamentally going to exclude people who don't have the tech capability to do this. And I don't mean just the poor people. I mean, the elderly people who are just fundamentally not tech savvy. And we can't build for that. So I think the other core element of the DPI approach is to ensure that even in the design, that the design is kept really, really simple. I think the testament to this is the way in which UPI is used right now. Absolutely everyone knows how to use UPI. You don't particularly need to be literate. There is an innovation called the Soundbox, which the moment the money comes to you, it actually speaks out the amount that has been received. So that whether you're literate or not, if you're busy, if you're in a crowded marketplace, and you don't have the time to look at your phone, you can actually hear it while you're dealing with another customer to say that 200 rupees has come from the previous customer, so I've received the amount, and you can give the vegetables to that person. So constantly build for people who may not be tech savvy, may not have that capability of setting up complex technology systems. Build for the simple people who don't necessarily understand it. I think if we have these sorts of elements that are really at the core of the design of the market-facing, consumer-facing elements of DPI, then both these elements of exclusion will not happen. I think it's important to say that in any digital system, as you're building a digital system, it is actually quite hard to avoid 100% exclusion. There will always be someone who is excluded. That's just sort of the nature of things. There could be a whole set of circumstances under which they are. The idea is to constantly minimize that, to ensure that fewer and fewer people are excluded. That if we can never get to zero, how close to zero can we approach? And that should be the idea and the goal of not just DPI, any digital system that we build for public good.
That's true. That's a wonderful example of using that soundbox. I haven't come across a formal study, but I'm sure the use of audio in building trust is tremendous. And if somebody were to study this, I'm sure results will speak for the impact of sound on the trust building on digital payments. I'm pretty sure about that. As we come to the end of our conversation, I remember just a couple of days back, you have written that India too can learn from a few things from Brazil's DPI. What are those, very quickly?
No, look, I mean, I think Brazil is quite remarkable in that its digital payment system, Pix, launched I think in 2020 or 2021, in the middle of COVID, and has already scaled. It's not that the level of the volume of transactions that India has, but really, really fast. They've got very powerful open finance systems, which are the equivalent of India's DEPA there. They have really powerful internal government data sharing systems. They've got this principle that if you tell the government, provide the government one piece of data, once, you should never have to provide it again. This is sort of similar to Estonia, where they have this once only principle. And the idea is that, we go to various government departments. Sometimes we go to different departments in the same ministry. And you'll have to fill out forms and say the same thing that just yesterday you gave to another department of that same building. Why should we have to do this? Is there not an efficient way to do this? Of course, the government shouldn't be allowed to just take information where it goes, but with your consent, you should just be able to populate these fields, because why are you giving so much information to the government again and again? So these are the sorts of things that Brazil has built. And as I was looking at it, when we started out, you said this is the India way. When you look at countries like Brazil, you say, look, there is also something that those countries are doing that we can learn from. This particular thing about constantly giving the government more and more information really struck me as something that I think here in India we could ideally build a DPI to eliminate that. In which case, it would make all of our lives easier. So as we go through, this DPI journey, and we start working with other countries, I think during the G20, India brought this idea of DPI to the global stage, and as a result of that, we got stories from from all over the globe of various different types of DPI that people have built. And as we look through those, we shouldn't say that this is only our priority, our prerogative. We are the ones who invented it. We should literally go and say, wow, that's a good idea that someone in Rwanda has created. We have a good opportunity. Let's just implement that in our context. And I think that really is the way this new approach to data governance is going to get power in the consideration of everyone around the world.
But as you mentioned, the G20 context, so the G20 train will now go from India to Brazil and then subsequently to South Africa. So do you see some major trends of exports of DPI from India?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think India is very committed to sharing its DPI learnings and everything that it has with the rest of the world. And I have no doubt that will happen. I'm not entirely sure what will be the contents of Brazil's DPI. We will learn, I guess, by the end of the month, when Brazil takes over, we will learn what their priorities are. But given the fact that Brazil has so many powerful DPIs, I'm actually very hopeful that they will leverage the good work that India did and carry it further. If it went to some other country after India and after the Indian DPI story, I would have been less hopeful. But given how Brazil is already very much invested in digital, Brazil's government has got a very strong digital government element. It would, I would be very hopeful that Brazil would carry on the work that India started in its presence.
Fantastic. I think it has been a fabulous conversation on some of the most profound themes. And to close this conversation, Rahul, help us understand. Prime Minister is repeatedly saying 2047 and India has to be Viksit Bharat, from a developing to a developed country. How do you see this transition, and what is the role you envision for DPIs? How important DPIs are going to be in achieving that goal of Viksit Bharat?
So, look, I think digital is a very important part of any developmental story. Whether you are a highly developed country or an underdeveloped country, digital is a very important element in that. Now, the only form of digitalization that gives governments sovereign control over how this would take place is digital public infrastructure, where the actual infrastructure the roads, the highways, etc., of the digital ecosystem are at least controlled in some way by the sovereign, where it has the ability to allow private innovation on those highways, but at the same time can control misuse of those highways. And if we're saying that we're going to be a developed country in 2047, the way in which we can get there clearly is through some of these sorts of tools and techniques that we have developed here through the DPI journey. There are many alternatives to digitalization, as we discussed earlier. There is this vendor-driven approach. There is private sector approach. But the one that I would imagine is best aligned to achieving outcomes that are in national interest would be really this DPI approach, because there is enough control, but at the same time, there is the opportunity for innovation. And I think that is going to be key to India becoming a developed country. Key, I mean, I can't imagine how we will become a developed country without DPI. That's sort of the way I would put it. But for DPI, I think this sort of a timeline is impossible. It will take us at least another 20 more years to become a developed nation if we cannot leverage DPI type innovations.
Thank you very much, Rahul, for this conversation. And I must say that the third way, as a book, I see is an important book at this point in time for every student of law, economics, public policy, tech policy, for every researcher, for every policymaker. I would say that one must engage with the book. It is such a profound book. Thank you for your time and the insights.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and a wonderful conversation.